Movies can create a lot of reactions: joy, terror, sympathy, complete bewilderment. For those that elicit that last one, we've got a comprehensive guide to what the heck happened. In 2001, teen angst got a new name when Donnie Darko first released. Richard Kelly's cult classic stars Jake Gyllenhaal as the title character, a troubled suburban boy who's told by a mysterious rabbit man on a golf course that the world will end in 28 days, 6 hours, 42 minutes, and 12 seconds. He returns home to find that a falling jet engine has completely crushed his bedroom, and things start to get even weirder in the weeks that follow as he learns the truth about time travel. The ending, which finds him back at the start of the movie's timeline, is much more difficult to parse.
I can only hope that the answers will come to me in my sleep.
Reams have been written about the true meaning of Donnie Darko's ending, but the nugget-sized version is essentially this. Donnie is a sort of locus point for a tear in the space-time continuum. Although he spends much of the film unaware of it, his actions during most of his screen time take place in an alternate universe, where he needs to set the universe straight. The only way he can do this is by returning to the day he received the prophecy and allowing the jet engine to crush him to death. Jake Gyllenhaal loves a good mind-bender. Enemy follows the actor as Adam, a history professor who discovers that he has an exact double. The story feels like a particularly menacing dream, and at no point is this more evident than when the movie ends with Gyllenhaal walking into his bedroom to find that his wife has turned into a giant spider. The ending leaves a whole lot unexplained. As director Denis Villeneuve put it, it's a movie that is set to a game. It's not something that gives answers. It creates a lot of questions in your mind, but it's set like a puzzle. To solve this puzzle, focus on two keys: Adam's opening lecture on dictatorships and the meaning of the spider. Villeneuve has hinted that the real enemy in Enemy is what he calls the dictator inside ourselves. The opening monologue is about how dictators distract subjects from their problems with the entertainment of bread and circuses.
And it's important to remember this, that this is a pattern that repeats itself throughout history.
Coupling that with Villeneuve's suggestion that both protagonists are two parts of a single persona suggests that the double may in fact be an invention of the dictator in Adam's mind. And what problems are he distracting himself from? The women in his life, represented in his mind by spiders. Based on a novel from Bret Easton Ellis, American Psycho is a satirical horror story about the inner life of Patrick Bateman, a high-paid investment banker in 1980s New York. He's also, if you believe his inner monologue, an unhinged serial killer and sadist. But the final scene of the film calls everything into question. Bateman's powerful position is no coincidence, as his status allows him to get away with things that most people would go to prison for. That said, the executive's body count is called into question as the story progresses, and he starts to see things that clearly aren't real. It's impossible to know exactly what's real and what's a delusion, as the only thing that's truly clear is that Bateman is utterly insane. Following a night of murder, a police manhunt, and a confession to his lawyer, Bateman attends a social occasion to find that nothing's changed. Either he's done nothing at all, or his crimes have been of so little interest to his peers that they haven't caused a single ripple. By the end, the question of whether or not Bateman's murders really happened is irrelevant. No one would have gone after him either way.
No new knowledge can be extracted from my telling. This confession has meant nothing.
The Silent Hill series of movies and games presents the idea of an other world beneath our own, where physical spaces remain mostly the same except they're run down and populated by demons. Separating the real world and the other world is a misty in-between, where humans and the monsters can cross paths. This realm is seemingly confined to the town of Silent Hill, at least at first. In the movie version, Rose and her adopted daughter Sharon remain in the mist even as they leave town and return home. Christopher, Rose's husband, seems to sense their presence, but they occupy different planes of reality. The implication is that a part of the force that corrupted Silent Hill followed them home, keeping mother and daughter in their cloudy purgatory. It's probably because Sharon was a part of the spirit Alessa, who had been burned as a witch by the people of Silent Hill and sought vengeance from beyond the grave. Now that the two halves of the spirit have reunited, the world beneath reality has followed Alessa beyond the borders of the town. Director Christoph Gans explained his take on the series' mythology in 2006, saying, "Here we are dealing with a character who has the capacity to split, and when you realize that Alessa is no longer one character but many, it explains the story of the town. It's interesting because the town itself mirrors this fractured psychology, different dimensions, different doubles of the same person." Near the beginning of Christopher Nolan's Tenet, the protagonist is told something that can definitely apply to the movie as a whole.
Don't try to understand it. Feel it.
That said, it's definitely possible to understand what's going on once you fully comprehend the nature of inverted time. In an effort to prevent a third world war, the protagonist links up with fresh-faced agent Neil, and the two eventually embark on a temporal pincer movement, along with some Tenet troops. By sending one team forward and the other backward, they're able to save the day, but as the action unfolds, we see two different versions of Neil. As it turns out, Neil isn't exactly a rookie. He'd previously been recruited by the protagonist in the future, even if the protagonist doesn't necessarily realize it in the present. The second Neil is his future self, uninverted in time.
You've known me for years.
For me, I think this is the end of a beautiful friendship.
But for me, it's just the beginning.
To make things even more confusing, it's also revealed that the protagonist was the one who founded the Tenet agency in the future and has been communicating with the past. It was him who set the entire chain of events in motion by recruiting himself from the past into the organization that he would later create, forming a temporal causality loop. Speaking of temporal causality loops, Predestination takes it to the extreme. Ethan Hawke plays a time-traveling temporal bureau agent on the hunt for a terrorist called the Fizzle Bomber, while undercover as a bartender in the 1970s. He strikes up a conversation with a writer named John, and the two find out that they have a lot in common. That's because the agent is actually a future version of John, who was born Jane and later underwent gender reassignment surgery after childbirth. However, Jane only got pregnant in the first place because during one of the agent's first assignments, he romanced his younger self and she had a baby. After that, the agent steals the child and delivers it to the doorstep of the orphanage he grew up in as Jane. The agent isn't just a future version of Jane, but he's also his own father and mother. But wait, there's more. When Hawke's agent tracks down the Fizzle Bomber, he's shocked to find that it's his own future self, having gone mad from too much time travel. If the agent is going to stop him, he'll have to kill his future self, which ironically will cement his transformation into the Fizzle Bomber. All of the movie's major characters end up being a single person, whose paradoxical creation was seemingly orchestrated by the Temporal Bureau. Blade Runner may not have been so confusing when it was first released in 1982. Famously the victim of studio interference, its original version was a pretty straightforward cyberpunk thriller about future cop Rick Deckard, who's tasked with hunting down fugitive androids called replicants. Over the next 2 decades, though, expanded versions of the film added elements that make the ending much more cryptic and rewarding. Beginning with one of those expanded editions, new footage was included that suggested that Deckard was far more than just a future law enforcer. In a newly added sequence, Deckard dreams about a unicorn, and when Gaff leaves an origami unicorn behind, it suggests that he's been able to access Deckard's memories, which would mean that Deckard is actually a replicant himself.
You know that void comp test of yours? Did you ever take that test yourself?
Over the years, the film's director, movie critics, and even star Harrison Ford have all weighed in on what the new ending really meant and whether Deckard was a human or not. The long-awaited sequel, Blade Runner 2049, glosses over the question, leaving fans to continue the debate of Deckard's identity. While 2049 director Denis Villeneuve prefers to leave the interpretation up to the viewer, the franchise's creator Ridley Scott answered the question himself in an interview with Digital Spy, saying in no uncertain terms, he is definitely a replicant. Before he helmed Blade Runner 2049, director Denis Villeneuve sat behind the camera for the psychological sci-fi drama Arrival. The movie takes a linguistic approach to the concept of first contact, as it centers on grieving language professor Louise Banks as she tries to figure out how to talk to creatures from beyond the stars. Banks teams up with physicist Ian Donnelly and other scientists to try and come to understand the seven-legged visitors. As she deciphers the strange language, visions of her daughter's untimely death plague her, but she presses onward anyway. When communication with the aliens turns into an arms race between the visited countries, Banks comes to an important understanding. Being able to read the circular script changes the way a person perceives time. She's able to use this knowledge to stop a massive war before it begins, but more importantly, the truth about her daughter is revealed. It turns out that Banks's visions aren't from the past, but from the future. After successfully completing their mission, she and Donnelly are destined to get together and have a child, whose premature passing will tear their relationship apart. Despite knowing exactly how tragically things will eventually turn out, Banks decides to let fate play out in the way she saw it. Martin Scorsese usually isn't the type of director to put a massive twist at the end of his movies, but Shutter Island was the exception. This psychological thriller stars Leonardo DiCaprio as Edward Daniels, a U.S. Marshal in search of a killer who may or may not be suffering from delusions. However, the perpetrator ends up being the person Daniels least expected, himself. Daniels, whose real name is Andrew Latis, murdered his wife in a fit of rage after she killed their 2 children. To cope with the tragedy, Latis invented an alternate identity and false reality that saw him investigating a hospital for the criminally insane. The truth is that the man he believes to be his crime-fighting partner is actually the doctor treating him at the institution through role-playing therapy. Unconvinced that Latis's psyche is fully healed, doctors suggest that he may be required to undergo a full lobotomy, prompting Latis to ponder a difficult question.
Which would be worse? To live as a monster? Or to die as a good man?
While the author of the book the movie is based on, Dennis Lehane, insists that Latis wouldn't allow the lobotomy of his own free will, the film's psychiatric advisor James Gilligan sees it differently. While speaking with The Guardian, Gilligan said he believes that Latis, consumed with guilt for what he's done, would indeed volunteer for the lobotomy as penance for his crimes. Adapted from the short story We Can Remember It For You Wholesale by sci-fi luminary Philip K. Dick, Total Recall ditched the source material's more cerebral story in favor of action spectacle once Arnold Schwarzenegger was cast in the lead role. That doesn't mean it's not without its more thought-provoking elements, though, as the ending leaves audiences with plenty to think about. It all starts when blue-collar worker Douglas Quaid decides to pay for implanted memories of an exciting adventure on Mars, where he plays the role of secret agent. The problem is, before he can undergo the procedure, he suddenly realizes that the spy stuff might actually be for real. Throughout the adventure, Quaid doesn't know what to believe. Is he actually an undercover operative working for a ruthless tyrant, or is he experiencing a complex delusion? There's evidence for both sides of the debate, but when you take a closer look, it becomes clear that the entire film is actually just an implanted memory. In addition to plenty of on-screen clues, director Paul Verhoeven, in his commentary on the DVD release, confirms his belief that the adventure was all a false reality by saying, "The dream really starts at the moment that he falls asleep, so the next scene, which seems to be a malfunction of the machine, is part of the dream."
I just had a terrible thought. What if this is a dream?
Well, then kiss me quick before you wake up.
A dark and surreal romantic comedy, The Lobster is set in a world where single people have 45 days to find a mate, and if they don't, they face the strange consequence of being turned into an animal of their choosing. A group of loners has defied the system, and the government offers extra days to singles who capture these misfits. Here we meet David, whose wife has recently left him. Singles can't pair up at random, though. They have to have something in common, whether it's frequent nosebleeds or a nice smile. David is short-sighted, and when he runs away from his hotel and joins the loners, he meets a woman who's short-sighted too. They're a perfect match, but love is forbidden amongst the loners. So as punishment for their affair, the loner leader has the woman blinded, so they no longer have a shared characteristic. The final scene depicts David deciding if he should blind himself to keep their relationship going, but it cuts to black before his choice is revealed. Audiences and critics have debated whether or not David actually goes through with it. Colin Farrell, who played David, has his own opinion. He told Entertainment Weekly, "Part of me thinks he does it." However, he wasn't willing to rule out any possibility, and director Yorgos Lanthimos has kept his mouth shut on the subject. One of the most surprising horror film hits of the 2010s, Hereditary shocked audiences with a story that stuns on many levels. At first, it appears to be a simple tale of demonic possession and family trauma, but after an onslaught of horrifying revelations, it all culminates in an ending that remains both upsetting and perplexing. Hereditary begins after the death of Ellen, mother to Annie and grandmother of teenagers Peter and Charlie. Not long after the funeral, though, Charlie is horrifically killed in a car accident, leaving the family reeling from multiple tragedies. When Annie turns to the occult to cope, she comes to believe that the ghost of her daughter is hunting them, and that leads to the discovery that Ellen was actually the leader of a coven of witches. The ending of Hereditary is a lot to take in, and it's easy to miss what's really going on through all the horrific imagery. Annie is possessed by a demon, and the surviving witches arrive to worship Charlie's rotting head. Following Ellen's death, they seek to resurrect their demon king Payman and give him a male host body. This had eluded them for years, since Annie had kept Peter at arm's length from Ellen, but in the film's last scene, Peter becomes host to the demon and crowned king of the devilish witches.
Hail, Payman! Hail, Payman!
Looper, the movie, not the channel, is centered around Joe, a retired hitman from the future who's sent back in time to be killed by his younger self in order to close his loop. Things go awry, and young Joe reluctantly decides to work with his future self to eliminate the telekinetic mob boss known as the Rainmaker. As the story unfolds, younger Joe falls in love with a woman named Sarah and recognizes that her son Sid is the Rainmaker as a child. As a result, the two versions of Joe are forced into a showdown over the fate of Sarah and Sid. Older Joe wants them dead to undo the Rainmaker's crimes, but young Joe knows that Sid will survive and become a villain. That's when young Joe realizes that the only way to save the day is to do the unthinkable. In the end, young Joe kills himself, erasing his older self's existence entirely, saving Sarah and preventing Sid from becoming the Rainmaker in the first place. This has confused some fans. After all, if Joe dies when he's younger, how did any of the events of the film ever happen? Director Rian Johnson argues that the ending is less about the internal logic of time travel and more about character drama. As he told Gizmodo, "When you're watching it, you understand what's going on and it makes sense to you. Even if thinking about it, it seems not logical, it makes sense on a storytelling level. And that, at the end of the day, is what matters." Comedian Jordan Peele broke out as a director with 2017's Get Out, a psychological horror movie that won him an Academy Award for Best Original Screenplay. And 2 years later, he returned to the genre with Us. Lupita Nyong'o stars as Adelaide Wilson, whose family is stalked and attacked by mysterious, twisted doppelgangers from under the ground, known as the Tethered. The Wilson family aren't the only ones with evil twins, though. Everyone in the United States is attacked by their own tethered duplicate. Seemingly no one is safe, but Adelaide is particularly shaken up because she had a traumatic encounter with her lookalike as a child. However, the end of the film reveals that there was more to their meeting than a simple scare. Back in 1986, the tethered version of Adelaide knocked the original unconscious and used the opportunity to take her twin's place on the surface. Adelaide, now trapped underground, rallied the rest of the tethered to rise up against their oppressors.
I needed to make a statement that the whole world would see.
Inspired by the Hands Across America shirt that Adelaide was wearing when she was kidnapped, the tethered join hands to form a massive chain of monstrous doubles. It's a powerful message to remind everyone in the US that their happiness often comes at the expense of others that most of us never even think about, let alone see. Director Darren Aronofsky isn't a big fan of subtlety, and nowhere is this more obvious than in his 2017 film, Mother. This critically panned stress fest couldn't possibly be more obvious once you start thinking about it in biblical terms. Mother follows a writer referred to as him, whose pregnant wife, Mother, isn't happy when he agrees to shelter a visiting doctor. As events progress, the doctor's wife and 2 adult sons arrive as well, creating conflict as the writer begins toiling on his latest work. These 4 represent Adam, Eve, Cain, and Abel, which becomes a bit more clear when one son kills the other. After that, it becomes a story that's hard to summarize without going beat by beat, but to make a long story short, it concludes with the writer's throngs of fans swarming the home and horrifically killing the couple's newborn son. That's when Mother sets fire to the house in a fit of rage, killing everyone inside. Her husband, who represents God, reaches into her chest cavity and removes a crystal object similar to one that had been destroyed earlier in the film, which magically rebuilds the house and couple anew. The story itself isn't meant to be taken literally. Told from the perspective of Mother Earth herself, it's a metaphor for mankind's impact on nature, with a deeply environmentalist message. Aronofsky himself has said that the entire film is about the devastating damage caused by man-made climate change. Jacob's Ladder follows the last days of a soldier turned postal worker named Jacob Singer as his reality becomes invaded by demons and hellish visions. He meets a scientist who once worked with the military to experiment on soldiers with psychedelic drugs meant to put them into killing frenzies. Jacob believes this to be the reason for his visions, but the ending of the movie reveals that the truth goes even deeper. Similar to the 1890 short story An Occurrence at Owl Creek Bridge, Jacob's Ladder is about the last dream of a dying man killed by fellow soldiers in an unexplained attack. Perhaps the reality of the film is that Jacob's mind is attempting to sort out a meaning for his senseless death. The opening of the movie wasn't a flashback of his past in Vietnam, it was the last day of his life. As the movie ends, he dies on the battlefield, his tormented journey over at last. So why the hellish visions, and why do they turn more peaceful at the end, showing Jacob ascending into heaven with his son? Jacob's chiropractor, Louis, who serves as his guardian figure in the movie, quotes a 14th century mystic to foreshadow what might happen if one tries to resist their death.
If you've made your peace, then the devils are really angels, freeing you from the earth.
Vanilla Sky was definitely not the movie Cameron Crowe and Tom Cruise fans were expecting to see when they filed into theaters in December of 2001. Instead of a feel-good romance or a fun coming-of-age story, they got a moody, elliptical remake of a Spanish film. After an accident disfigures his face, Cruise's feckless playboy David spirals into depression, has reconstructive surgery, and learns some unexpected truths. Ultimately, viewers are told that much of what they've seen is a lucid dream in David's brain, which has been held in cryonic stasis for more than 100 years. The more troubling elements of the narrative are the result of a glitch in the system. He's given the choice to either reboot the dream or exit it once and for all by jumping off a building and being brought back to life.
Your panel of observers are waiting for you to choose.
David ultimately decides to jump, and the last shot shows him opening his eyes, presumably for real. There are lots of interpretations of Vanilla Sky, some of which were supplied by Crowe himself in the commentary track for the DVD, but the correct one might just be accepting what you see on screen as the actual events of the story. Crowe seemed to lean that direction while talking with film school rejects about the unused alternate ending, saying, "You want people to understand what you're going for, so the question is, looking at both endings, did the pendulum swing too much in the direction of us explaining stuff? I think it did. The original ending was more open-ended, a little less explained."
Our hero in the Matrix franchise, Neo, was the only one with enough power to break the Matrix and save humanity. He spent the first two films on an apparent collision course with the near-invincible artificial intelligence program known as Agent Smith. But when their cataclysmic fight in the third installment finally arrived, Neo gave up? So what happened at the end of the Matrix Revolutions? Neo lies on the brink of defeat until he realizes he doesn't need to beat Smith at all. Neo assimilates into the system and Smith is wiped out while the Matrix reboots. Say what? Whoa! The dedicated fans of The Matrix 101 picked apart the scene to figure out what really went down, and here's what they discovered. Neo brokered a sort of truce with the machines, allowing the continued existence of the Matrix free zone known as Zion, while healing the corruption in the program personified by Smith. The machines also grant every human the chance to be unplugged from the Matrix and live in the real world or to remain living in their artificial reality. The essay concludes on a hopeful note. This is a world where eradication of the enemy is seen for what it is, a symptom of the problem, not a solution. This is a world where the creator and its creation have the potential to live fruitfully in peace and cooperation. Darren Aronofsky's The Fountain features 3 interlocking stories, each set hundreds of years apart, all about a couple coming to terms with death, and culminates in a wild, weird ending. In one timeline, a doctor works to cure the brain tumor of his wife, Izzy. She's written a book in which a Spanish conquistador searches for the Tree of Life for his queen. Meanwhile, in the future, a cosmonaut heads for a distant nebula and a biosphere containing the tree, interacting with Izzy's spirit along the way. It all ends in the cosmonaut's fiery death, the tree's rebirth, and an ending in which Izzy's spirit hands Tom fruit from the tree, which he plants in her grave. Yep. It's all deeply symbolic, and anyone hoping for a literal explanation out of The Fountain will be somewhat frustrated. Aronofsky himself told the Washington Post, "It's a Rubik's Cube of a story that's ultimately really about coming to grips with our own mortality." He elaborated further in an interview with Ain't It Cool News. It's a film that's a journey, and it's a trip, and it's an experience through the meditation of a lot of these questions. There are ideas in there that I believe, but I think I wanted to leave it open so that anyone can bring their own beliefs to the table, and that it could awaken them, and people can have a conversation. So there you have it, your own interpretation is the right one, apparently. Whoa. Christopher Nolan's sci-fi epic Interstellar is pretty cool, but it's also pretty confusing, particularly in its final act. Astronaut Joseph Cooper, on a desperate mission to find a new home for humanity, plummets into a black hole and drifts beyond the event horizon, finding himself inside a tesseract. There, he can see inside his daughter's bedroom at any point in her life. He communicates with her through gravity and Morse code, guiding her to unlock the equation that helps humanity escape Earth. By the end, Cooper is discovered floating through space by later members of the human race he's saved, brought to meet his dying daughter, who's aged at normal speed while he's been on his intergalactic travels and is thus much older than he is. Huh? The whole film rests on the notion that time is a circle, and future humans have the ability to travel within it. But they only get there by creating this tesseract and helping past people, namely Cooper and his daughter Murph, finish their work. It's a total chicken or the egg style paradox, but just go with it. And while Cooper was off traveling through the wormholes, little Murphy was living on the surface of the circle and kicking this whole journey into gear from a science level until her dad came back to it, like he promised. Figuring out the Babadook isn't that difficult, provided you keep up with the sudden change in perspective in the movie's final act. Much of this indie horror hit looks and feels like a supernatural home invasion picture, with the creepy Babadook creature tormenting a single mother and her 6-year-old son. But there's more going on beneath the surface. In the film's closing scenes, the Babadook has possessed the mom and she tries to strangle her son, but the boy draws the monster out of her with a tender expression of love. And a knife to the leg, of course.
I know you don't love me. The Babadook won't let you. But I love you, Mum.
The boy's plan works, and the mom sends the Babadook fleeing to the basement, where Mom has stored all mementos of her husband since his death. That's when we realized the creature wasn't supernatural at all. It was her years of repressed grief, which had grown so powerful it threatened to destroy the lives of everything it touched. In a perfect blend of heartwarming and gross, the Babadook's closing moments show mother and son gathering a bowl of worms, which he takes into the basement to feed the vanquished beast. She'll always carry the monster with her because, after all, you can't get rid of the Babadook. In David Robert Mitchell's film It Follows, a girl named Jay has a seemingly ordinary hookup, but soon after, she's horrified to realize she's been infected with a sexually transmitted ghost.
Who are you gonna call? Someone else.
The ghost takes various human forms, ranging from people in the victim's memories or creepy, naked strangers that only someone affected with the disease can see. It constantly walks in the direction of the latest person infected until it grabs them and kills them. Then, the ghost starts walking in the direction of the previous person infected and continues back down the line. Your only option is to pass it off to someone else, hoping the chain keeps going so that the ghost never gets to you. If that sounds ridiculous, well, it kinda is. But it's the setup for a pretty devilish little film. Jay learns she can only escape the evil spirit that's trying to kill her by sleeping with someone else to pass it on. Ultimately, she and her friends try killing it, with generally unpleasant and ambiguous results. After the climactic battle, Jay and her friend Paul have sex, and later Paul's seen driving past a group of prostitutes. In the film's final shot, the duo walk down a street while someone, or something, follows behind. Much of It Follows is open to interpretation, and that's exactly what Mitchell wanted. As he said in multiple interviews, he was originally inspired by a nightmare in which he knew he was being followed, knew he couldn't get away, and knew no one could help him. As for the ambiguity of that last shot, totally intentional. Mitchell wanted viewers to decide whether it was still following Jay and her pals or not. Sleep tight, kids. There are no shortage of theories about what exactly was going on in Stanley Kubrick's 1968 sci-fi classic, 2001: A Space Odyssey. Rather than dive too far down that rabbit hole, let's instead offer Kubrick's own assessment of the end, in which astronaut Dave Bowman comes into contact with an extraterrestrial monolith and goes through a bizarre succession of experiences. Vast space travel, seeing himself at different ages, and finally being transformed into a floating space fetus. Kubrick explained in an interview, "In a timeless state, his life passes from middle age to senescence to death. He is reborn, an enhanced being, a star child, an angel, a Superman if you like, and returns to Earth prepared for the next leap forward of man's evolutionary destiny. This is what happens on the film's simplest level. But what about the levels that aren't so simple? Kubrick pointed out that 2001 concerns itself with elements of philosophy and metaphysics that have nothing to do with the bare plotline. So whatever his summary tells you about Bowman's fate, you can trust there's more to it, and that any extra meaning is entirely up to you."
I'm sorry, Dave. I'm afraid I can't do that.
Kubrick's explanation continued, "The film becomes anything the viewer sees in it. If the film stirs the emotions and penetrates the subconscious of the viewer, if it stimulates, however inchoately, his mythology and religious yearnings and impulses, then it has succeeded. Got all that? Great. Just meet us down at the bar once you've done stimulating your mythological and religious yearnings and impulses, or whatever."
Christopher Nolan's 2010 film left audiences mind-spinning as much as the top in the final shot. Just when it looks like the top is about to spin out and tumble, the screen cuts to black. The final shot shows Dom Cobb reuniting with his kids, but we never know if it's really happening or if it's a dream. Fans debated the scene endlessly for years after Inception came out, but according to Nolan, the non-ending is actually kind of the whole point. In 2015, the director gave the commencement speech at Princeton University and told the grads to chase their reality. He used the ending of Inception as an example, saying Cobb was off with his kids. He was in his own subjective reality. He didn't really care anymore, and that makes a statement. Perhaps all levels of reality are valid. The camera moves over the spinning top just before it appears to be wobbling. It was cut to black. In short, the ending of the movie is up to us, and we're right either way. The ending to Nolan's Dark Knight trilogy isn't quite as vague as Inception, but it still left viewers debating after the credits started rolling. After flying a nuclear bomb out of Gotham City, Batman escapes the blast off-screen. We know this because later, while Alfred is in Florence, he sees Bruce Wayne sitting at a table enjoying a meal with ex-Catwoman Selina Kyle. Some fans have theorized that this is all a dream, that Batman actually died in the explosion, and that Alfred simply imagined seeing his friend taking in the Italian sunshine. But that's bat baloney. Before the movie's end, we learn, along with Lucius Fox, that Wayne fixed the Batplane's autopilot 6 months before the final showdown in Gotham. That's all the exposition necessary for viewers to know that Batman jumped out while the plane flies the bomb toward the bay. When Alfred sees Wayne in Florence, it's exactly how Alfred describes it earlier in the film, but that's not a dream. It's just the best way for Wayne to show Alfred he's alive. Moreover, Selina Kyle is there wearing Wayne's mother's necklace, which she steals at the beginning of the movie. Alfred doesn't know she and Wayne have become an item, and he'd already quit working for Bruce before Batman and Catwoman teamed up to save Gotham City. As if all that isn't enough, Christian Bale himself thinks that Bruce is alive by the end of the movie. He explained during an interview while promoting Exodus: Gods and Kings.
He was just content with me being alive and left because that was always the life that he wanted for him. And I find it very interesting, and with most films, I tend to always say it's what the audience thinks it is. My personal opinion is, no, it was not a dream, that was for real. And he was just delighted that finally he had freed himself from the privilege, but ultimately the burden of being Bruce Wayne.
Alejandro G. Iñárritu's film about a washed-up actor trying to make a comeback on Broadway has the kind of weird ending that puts Inception to shame. Throughout the film, Regan Thompson is shown as having superpowers, only to have them later be explained as being all in his head. In the final scene, Regan's daughter, Sam, enters his hospital room to find his bed empty and the window open. Sirens and voices can be heard coming from the street below. Initially, Sam looks down, but she slowly turns her head up to the sky and she smiles. Some might think this means Regan actually does have powers and has flown away, but probably not. What really seems to have happened is that Regan has successfully committed suicide, which he failed to do on the previous day. Sam, for her part, seems to start hallucinating just like her dad. The fact that she has bird tattoos on her arm and that her father played a superhero with bird-based powers suggests the strong connection between the two. Sam seems to leave the real world to enter a fantasy where her father is still alive, soaring above the clouds. The film is subtitled The Unexpected Virtue of Ignorance after all. Here, Sam chooses to ignore reality. One of Birdman's 4 screenwriters, Alexander Dinelaris Jr., hinted during an interview with HuffPost Live that the key to their understanding of the ending lies within Sam's relationship with her father. I think when we found the relationship with the daughter, we started to understand what Regan's story was. Once she got down, Emma's big monologue in the basement, we started to understand the relationship and what it was. We're not going to sit around and explain the ending. At the end of this Coen Brothers flick, tortured writer Barton Fink wanders onto a beach where he meets a woman resembling the picture decorating his sparse, depressing hotel room. Shortly after they meet, the movie abruptly ends, potentially leaving some viewers scratching their heads. What's it mean? Here's one way to look at it. The picture represents the idea of Hollywood. It's a place of fantasy, beaches, and beautiful women. Meanwhile, throughout the entire film, Fink is subjected to the reality of Hollywood. He's had his script torn apart by an executive. He found out his hero, writer W.P. Mayhew, is a washed-up alcoholic, and that Mayhew's wife writes his novels for him, and he's fled from both a burning hotel and a shotgun-wielding maniac. You'd think that finally finding the woman on the beach would mean that Fink is at the end of his trials, having reached his reward and a place where he feels safe. But in fact, he's learned the truth about the dangerous world in which he now exists. Joel Coen explained in a 1991 interview, some people have suggested that the whole second part of the film is nothing but a nightmare. But it was never our intention to, in any literal sense, depict some bad dream, and yet it is true that we were aiming for a logic of the irrational. We wanted the film's atmosphere to reflect the psychological state of the protagonist. At the end of his blood-soaked neo-western, Sheriff Ed Tom Bell tells his wife about 2 dreams he has about his father. In the first dream, he loses some money his father gave him. In the second dream, Bell sees his father holding a torch, riding ahead into the darkness of a snowy mountain pass. Shortly before Bell tells the stories of his dreams, he tells his wife that his father died young. That, in a sense, his father will always be a younger man. More importantly, throughout the movie, Bell ponders the violence in the area where he's sheriff. And since he's close to retirement, he wonders whether he's too old for the world. The title of the movie is No Country for Old Men, and Bell is one of them. It's become too violent too quickly for someone of his age, and he can no longer cope. The world needs someone younger, like his father, to light the way in the ever-growing darkness around it, exactly like the second dream Bell describes. David Lynch fans don't watch his work for straightforward narratives, but even in the context of his endearingly weird filmography, 2001's Mulholland Drive is tough to figure out. Lynch himself has steadfastly refused to help untangle the movie, which moves in jittery circles around an actress, a mysterious woman, and a film director, all of whom are mixed up in a dreamlike and frequently nonsensical series of events. Ultimately, the film's ending is every bit as open to interpretation as the rest of the film, and although viewers are welcome to delve into the many theories attempting to explain what Lynch might have meant, the best explanation was arguably posed by the late film critic Roger Ebert. According to him, the movie is hypnotic. We're drawn along as if one thing leads to another, but nothing leads anywhere, and that's even before the characters start to fracture and recombine like flesh caught in a kaleidoscope. There is no explanation. There may not even be a mystery. So, what's the explanation here? Pretty much whatever you want.